You have never actually stopped to ask the question. Not really. Not in the way that would require sitting with the answer long enough for the real one to surface, rather than the acceptable version that arrives first. The one that sounds like purpose and is organized well enough to hold up in conversation and has probably been cited often enough that it feels true. You know what you want, you know why you want it. You can trace the arc from where you are to where you are going with a clarity that most people find impressive and that you have come to rely on as evidence that you are someone who knows themselves well. The question is, what is running underneath that arc? Not the stated goal, not the project, the vision, the thing you are building, the force that makes stopping feel like dying, that interprets rest as stagnation, that finds a way to be dissatisfied even in the moments of genuine achievement, that has kept the movement continuous enough that there has never been a sustained period of simply being where you are, without the forward orientation, without the next thing already in construction. That force is not ambition. Ambition is the form it has taken. The force itself is older than anything you have consciously chosen, and it is pointed at something that has nothing to do with the goals it is using as fuel. You have been building toward something. The question is what it is actually for. And the answer, examined honestly rather than quickly, is almost certainly not what you have told yourself. Alfred Adler, whose work tends to get absorbed into the simplified versions of psychological theory without the specific argument that makes it most useful, spent considerable intellectual effort trying to understand what he called the style of life, the underlying logic that organizes a person's goals, relationships, and self-understanding into a coherent pattern. The style of life is not chosen consciously. It is assembled in early childhood in response to the specific experience of inferiority, by which Adler meant not pathological self-loathing, but the ordinary, universal experience of being small, dependent, and insufficient relative to the world one is trying to navigate. Every child experiences this. The response is not. Different children construct different compensatory logics, different strategies for achieving, in the social and external world, the sense of being adequate, of being capable, of being someone whose existence is justified by their capacity to do things that matter. The ambition that develops in some children, the particular drive that makes stopping feel like losing, that converts every achievement into a baseline from which the next ascent begins, is, in Adler's account, not the expression of genuine desire. It is the expression of a compensation. The person is not moving toward what they want. They are moving away from what they cannot tolerate feeling. This is a harder claim than it sounds, because the movement away has the same external shape as movement toward. The work is real. The achievements are real. The discipline and sacrifice and genuine skill that the compensation requires are all real. What is not real, or what is, at least, not what it presents as, is the relationship between the achieving and the achieving's actual function. The function is not the stated one. The function is the management of something that was never named, that was compressed into the drive early enough that it is now indistinguishable from personality. Here is the part that the surface account of ambition cannot reach. Think about what you imagine would be different if you succeeded, not in the domain of circumstances, which is obvious, but in the domain of internal experience. Not what you would have, but how you would feel about yourself. Not what your life would look like from the outside, but what the quiet moments alone would feel like once the specific achievement has been consolidated. Most driven people, when they allow themselves to actually imagine this, access something that has less to do with satisfaction and more to do with relief. The achievement in the fantasy does not produce the experience of wanting. It produces the experience of no longer having to prove. The goal is not a positive state being moved toward. It is the cessation of a negative state that has been running continuously, the state of not yet having established beyond challenge that you are enough. Enough for whom is the question that unlocks the mechanism. Nietzsche's concept of resentment the psychological state of someone who cannot enact genuine self-transformation, has a specific and under-examined application to driven people, one that is distinct from its more famous application to the resentful. The person organized around compensation does not experience resentment in the usual sense. They are too busy, too forward-oriented, too successful in the conventional terms to fit the profile. What they experience instead is a version of the same basic structure, the inability to locate the source of their drive in genuine desire because the drive was constructed not from desire, but from the need to answer a question that was posed before desire was developed enough to be consulted. The question was something like, am I capable enough to be worth something? Am I impressive enough to justify the space I take up? Am I the kind of person who produces results sufficient to exempt me from the verdict that was, implicitly or explicitly, being prepared for me in the environment I grew up in? The achieving is the answer. And the answer, however definitively it accumulates, never quite settles the question, because the question was never really about the achievements. It was about something that achievements cannot address, because it was decided at a level prior to achievement by a logic that achievement cannot retroactively revise. Here is the unexpected place this becomes most visible, and the one most difficult to examine: your relationship to recognition. Not the question of whether you want it, everyone does to some degree, and the philosophical positions that claim otherwise are usually performances of a more refined version of wanting it. The specific texture of your relationship to recognition, how it lands when it arrives, how long it lasts, what it does to the interior state, and for how long, and what the interior state returns to once the effect has subsided. For most people organized around compensatory ambition, the recognition arrives and produces something that is close to, but not quite satisfaction. It is closer to a temporary suspension of the drive, a brief cessation of the proving, a moment of respite from the continuous demonstration. And then it subsides. Not because the recognition was insufficient, often it was more than could have been reasonably expected, but because the recognition was directed at the achievement, and the achievement was a stand-in for the actual question, and the actual question was not answered by anything directed at the achievement. The question was not, is this work good? The question was, am I good? And the answer to the first question, however decisive, does not settle the second, because the second was not posed by a faculty that evaluates work. It was posed by a younger version of you in conditions that had nothing to do with professional performance, in response to something that had nothing to do with competence. The recognition that would settle it does not exist in any form that can be earned. It could only have been given freely, unconditionally, at a time that has passed. The drive is organized around producing, through achievement, the substitute for that gift. And the substitution is imperfect by design, because what is being asked for cannot be produced by any amount of achievement, which means the drive has no natural terminus. It will require more, always, not because you are greedy, but because the mechanism that generates the requirement was never about the achievements. It was about the absence that the achievements are trying to fill. Jung's description of the persona, the constructed social self that interfaces between the psyche and the world, applies to ambitious people in a specific and frequently uncomfortable way. The achiever's persona is, in most cases, extremely successful. It is legible, compelling, organized around genuine capacities that produce genuine results, and it generates social and professional returns that confirm its value. The persona works. The problem is not the persona. The problem is the degree to which the persona has become the entire project, the degree to which the self has been so thoroughly organized around the demonstration of capability that everything which does not serve the demonstration has been compressed into the shadow and left there, accumulating pressure. What goes into the shadow for the driven person is not primarily the dark material that popular accounts of shadow work focus on. It is the material that is incompatible with being always productive, always oriented, always able to point to forward progress as evidence of self-worth. The grief that cannot be scheduled, the need for rest that has no goal attached to it, the desire for connection that is not networking and does not produce anything useful, the experience of being genuinely moved by something that will never appear on a resume, the capacity for stillness that is not strategic, not the recovery from which more performance will emerge, but the actual, unproductive experience of existing without demonstrating anything. These are not weaknesses. They are the parts of being a person that have been assessed as incompatible with the persona and filed accordingly. And a self that has been operating without them for long enough begins to experience the specific flatness that ambitious people tend to encounter at the top of their most significant achievements. Not the flatness of having failed, but the flatness of having succeeded at a version of yourself that is not quite the whole version, and finding that the success, for all its reality, does not reach the part of you that needed something else entirely. William James had a formulation about the self that is directly relevant to this, though he was working toward different conclusions. He argued that the self is constituted in significant part by what it identifies with, by the commitments, relationships, projects, and capacities that it takes as its own, as extensions of the person rather than as things the person merely has. The achiever's self is constituted overwhelmingly by the achievement-producing apparatus, the discipline, the competence, the capacity for strategic orientation, the ability to translate ambition into results. This is genuine self-extension. It is not false. What it excludes is also genuine self in the sense that James was using. The capacities that the achievement orientation does not require, that it may in fact impede, have not been developed, have been treated as irrelevant to the project, and have therefore remained in the condition they were in at the moment the project began. The emotional intelligence that was not required, the tolerance for uncertainty that was never practiced because the drive replaced it with planning, the capacity for genuine receptivity, for being affected by something without immediately converting it into useful input, that was edged out by the continuous orientation toward production. The person who has been achieving for 20 years and has given all of it to the achievement apparatus has, in a meaningful sense, only developed one part of themselves with any consistency. The rest is there, available but immature, not because they lack the capacity, but because they have not, in any sustained way, attended to it. The ambition was not building a person, it was building a function, and functions, however impressive, are not the same thing as the person who was there before the function began. Frankl's observation about the space between stimulus and response has an application to ambition that tends to arrive as genuinely disturbing when it is considered carefully. The drive, the felt urgency of the next goal, the impossibility of sustained stillness, the quality of deprivation that arrives when forward motion is interrupted, is not experienced as a response to anything. It is experienced as the self's own orientation, as intrinsic motivation, as the expression of what one genuinely is and wants. It feels like it is coming from the inside. Frankl's claim was that the specifically human capacity is the capacity to stop between the stimulus and the automatic response, to insert the question of whether the response is what is genuinely chosen, to inhabit the space rather than being swept through it by forces whose origin has not been examined. The drive that organized your life before you were old enough to examine it is, in this sense, a stimulus. The continuous achievement behavior is the automatic response, and the space between them, the space in which the question of whether this is actually what you want could be asked and actually answered, has been so consistently bypassed by the urgency of the drive that its existence has become theoretical. You believe you know what you want because you have never stopped long enough to find out whether the knowing is genuine or inherited. The ambition feels like desire because it has the intensity of desire. What it does not have, what desire, genuinely generated, contains, is the quality of coming from somewhere that you freely chose. It has the quality of something that chose you, early, in conditions that did not offer an alternative, and that has been running ever since in the form of an identity that you have very successfully elaborated, but have never actually interrogated. The complication arrives now, and it is the one that makes the preceding argument more demanding rather than less. The compensation is real. The drive it generates is real. The achievements it has produced are real. And the relationships those achievements have built, the professional network, the reputation, the respect of people whose opinion you value, the identity that others have of you as someone who does things that matter, are real. None of this is fraudulent. What is also real is that the entire structure has been organized around answering a question that cannot be answered in this way. And dismantling the structure, even partially, even with sufficient care, is not simply a psychological adjustment. It is the alteration of the primary means by which you have, for as long as you can remember, produced the experience of being an adequate person. The instruction that the argument seems to generate, stop, examine, locate what you actually want beneath the compensatory drive, sounds clean when stated. It is not clean in practice because what is beneath the compensatory drive, when it becomes accessible, is not a purer desire waiting to be expressed. What is beneath the compensatory drive is initially the thing the drive was built to manage, the experience of insufficiency that launched the whole structure in the first place. The person who stops and actually sits in the stopping encounters, before anything else, the feeling that the stopping is wrong, that something is being lost, that they are, in some way they cannot quite name, falling behind. This feeling is not evidence that stopping was a mistake. It is evidence that the drive has been providing, as a side effect of its forward orientation, the management of something that is still there when the management pauses. The insufficiency is still present. The drive was covering it, not resolving it. Most people who get this far in the examination reach back for the drive, not because they are weak, because the drive is the only thing they have ever had that reliably produced the feeling of being adequate. And sitting in the insufficiency, without the drive providing its management function, requires something that the drive specifically prevented from developing: the capacity to be present to one's own experience without needing to convert it into evidence of forward progress. Marcus Aurelius, whose achievement was as complete as any human being's has been, emperor, philosopher, commander, the most powerful person in the Roman world, returned in his private notebooks to a single question with an insistence that has the quality of genuine struggle rather than philosophical exercise. What are you actually for? Not what are you building, not what will you leave. What are you actually for, in the sense of what is the thing that your existence is oriented toward at its deepest available level? His answer, which he had to keep returning to because it kept getting displaced by the demands of the world he was managing, was something like the continuous practice of what is genuinely good in the present moment, without reference to what it produces or proves or demonstrates, the good action that does not require an audience, the correct judgment that does not require external confirmation, the quality of mind exercised not in the service of the career or the legacy or the demonstration of philosophical competence, but simply because it is what the mind is for. This is not the answer that ambition generates. Ambition is almost always organized around a future state in which the having achieved will prove something. Marcus Aurelius is pointing at the possibility of existing in a way that does not require the proof, that finds its justification not in what it will eventually establish, but in what it actually is in this moment, independent of its consequences. For most driven people, this is the most threatening idea available, because it suggests that the entire structure, the goals, the orientation toward the next achievement, the continuous production of evidence, is not the answer to the question of how to live a meaningful life. It is the primary obstacle to it. Here is what an honest examination of the ambition tends to find in the specific quiet that is available when the drive is temporarily insufficient to prevent the examination. There is someone, not always living, sometimes long dead, sometimes a composite of several people or a generalized expectation assembled from a culture rather than a single source, in relation to whom the achievements have always been imagined. The success has always been seen through their eyes, measured against their standards, aimed at their recognition. The thing that was supposed to follow from achieving enough was not simply the experience of having achieved. It was the specific experience of having achieved in a way that would produce, from that particular direction, the verdict that has been sought for longer than the ambition has been active. You already know who this is. You may have never said it out loud. The drive that has organized your adult life is, in significant part, the attempt to produce, through the accumulation of external evidence, a verdict that was withheld or conditionally granted, or made to seem perpetually one more achievement away, in a context that predated your ability to choose what you were aiming for. The ambition is not primarily yours. It was assembled in response to someone else's standards, someone else's disappointment or expectation, or the specific quality of regard that felt like the only available basis for knowing that you were worth something. This is not a comfortable thing to know. It is not the kind of thing that can be known and then smoothly integrated into the existing structure. It requires, at minimum, a revision of the story you have been telling about what the drive is for, which is a revision of the story you have been telling about who you are. And that revision cannot be accomplished quickly or cleanly, or without some encounter with what has been compressed beneath the drive for the duration of its operation. What comes after the examination is not a different ambition. It is not the replacement of the compensatory drive with the pure, self-generated desire that was always there, waiting. There may not be a pure, self-generated desire. There may be, beneath the drive, something quieter and less legible, and less organized toward impressive outcomes, something that does not produce the feeling of purpose in the register that the drive produced it, but that has the quality of actually belonging to you rather than having been assembled in response to conditions that no longer exist. Nietzsche's genuinely self-overcoming person, the one he was actually describing when he was not being misread as celebrating domination, is not someone who has more drive than others. They are someone whose drive is genuinely their own, not the compensation, not the performance, not the proof being constructed for an audience that may not be watching. It is the drive that would remain if everything it had been organized to prove were already conceded, if the question of adequacy were simply not operative, and what remained were only the question of what is actually worth doing with the time available. Most driven people have never encountered that question. The compensatory drive fills the space where it would have to be asked. The movement prevents the stillness in which the question could form. And the question, because it has never been asked in anything other than the drive's own terms, has never been answered, which means the drive has never had a reason to stop, which is perhaps the most reliable evidence that the stopping is overdue, not to end the movement, not to abandon the building, but to find out for the first time whether the person doing the building knows what they are building it for, and to be willing, genuinely willing, to discover that the answer they have been living inside is not quite the true one.